This is my submission for the Reddit Terrain Building Competition Season 3, Call of the Elements. For me, this inspired the idea of living plants. Imagine a treant walking through the Feywild. It goes to sit down on a boulder and accidentally falls asleep for hundreds of years. In 5e, treants have the ability to awaken surrounding trees. I imagine their sap has the same life-giving power. When harnessed, it could be used to cure any ailment, but raw could bring any plant to life. Now imagine a group of goblins came across this secret, created an army of plant creatures to protect them while they built a treehouse on top of the end. Let's make that. To make this end, I'm going to need wire. A lot of wire.
Wow.
I started by cutting the wire to roughly equal lengths, and then I put that aside. Then, to make the armature, I twisted together 2 pieces of wire to create thick wire. I shaped the thick wire into the pose I wanted, keeping in mind the height of the rock I wanted it to rest on. I then bulked out the armature with a little bit of tinfoil. Then added the thick wire arms. I've seen trees made using this bundled wire technique before, but it was difficult to fit the wire around the armature. Eventually, I managed to cover it. Then I was able to start twisting the wires together to create big branches that split off into smaller ones. Once I was happy with the rough branch layout, I fixed the pose. This wasn't too difficult and I've cut myself. Once I was bandaged up, I further refined the branches, twisting them into more satisfying shapes. Then I set him aside and started making a comfy rock for him to sit on. To make the rock, I crumpled up some tinfoil, adding more until it was lumpy enough and tall enough. I then took that foil and smacked it until it was covered in clay. I then proceeded to smack it with different things until it looked like a rock. Eventually, it was looking pretty rockin', so I threw it in the oven to bake. And once baked, I reposed the legs to fit snugly around it. To make the next few minutes absolutely awful to watch, I used everyone's favorite flesh-colored Sculpting.
Not flesh.
I wrapped these upsetting skin flaps around the tree and smushed it until it was flush with the wire. Oh, also, I decided to give my Ent a little dinosaur tail. Covering each branch in clay was a pain, and it will continue to be a pain as I further refine the details. So to keep myself entertained, I went on to the face next. I wanted him to look like an old dad asleep in a chair, his chin resting on his chest. So I bulked out his chin, his eyes, and nose, then began refining the details until I was happy with the expression. Before adding more detail, I laid out cardboard where I wanted future platforms to go. This let me know what branches needed repositioning and what areas should be flattened to help with building later on. To create the knobbles and knots of the tree, I added some wormy dealies all over. I'm still working with rough shapes rather than refined details here. All this rooty texture is going to give the tree a much more gnarly look. I then of course gave him a dad bod, and added some branchy fingers because I wasn't happy with the look of the hands. Then I started adding detail to every branch. In sculpts like this, it's really important not to ignore certain areas. Not only will it be noticeable, it will also make them much harder to paint later on. As I was sculpting, I went outside to study trees. Bark has a very rough texture, so before adding the striations, I textured the whole sculpt. I started by using a sculpting tool, but I found what worked best was an old paintbrush that had dried latex on the back. I used this to texture most of the sculpt. Once it was looking nice and rough, I started adding the lines of bark. I really took my time with this step, adding areas where the bark had chipped off or where bits overlapped. I also used the lines of bark to accentuate his facial features. Eventually, I had to call the sculpt done, so I got it prepped for baking. Then I had the thought, is this going to fit into the oven? Luckily, it just fit. Never punished. I'm amazing. Once it was baked, I went in with a glue gun to add texture to the branches. This would be too annoying to do with clay. And with that, the sculpt is done, and it's time to move on to the treehouse. I started by foraging for materials like a goblin, and I got some good sticks.
Good sticks.
Then I put those good sticks in the oven to sterilize or whatever. I made a platform template that fit between the branches of the ant, then followed that to make a frame out of sticks. Then I did a quick fit check. Nice. Then I started building a deck on top of that frame. I used coffee stir sticks for this. And since this was made by goblins, I placed the planks purposefully crooked and janky. I imagine their decks are constantly breaking, so I gave them signs of repair as well. Next, using some balsa wood, I cut out some bigger, jankier planks. Why not just use coffee stir sticks? I don't know. I'm crazy. But surely I wouldn't waste time on something unless it was worth taking.
A long time.
I glued those time-consuming boards in place along the leg and back of the end. But Goblin Law requires a certain number of spiky sticks per building, so I added those in as supports. Then I made another balcony landing area out of more coffee stir sticks, this time sitting on top of the branches. But the goblins need a way to travel between these platforms, so off camera I made a staircase using sticks cut in half, and a ladder using smaller sticks. But the ladder didn't quite scream "I'm a crazy person," so I added tiny ropes to the joints. The goblins still needed a way to get up to the first walkway. I had the very adorable idea of making mushroom stairs. So using some beer bottle caps as armature, I sculpted some fungi. Can beer be a work expense? Remember to always sculpt the bottom of mushrooms no one's ever going to see. Once baked, I adhered the mushroom stairs in place with some superglue and some green stuff. With all the decks in place, it was time to build the treehouse. I didn't really have a plan for this, I just started cutting foam, building out shapes until I was happy with it. Once the shape looked good, I added some support beams and sticks to create the roof shapes. I then went outside, again, to forge some bark to use as the walls. Goblins are scavengers, building with whatever materials they can find. Sometimes that's metal, sometimes hide, but this is the Feywild, so it made the most sense for them to be using bark. I started to glue that bark in place, and then I burrowed a hole for the door. I filled the inside with black Mod Podge so the blue wouldn't show through. Then off camera I made this door using coffee stir sticks. I know I've seen this door somewhere. To shake things up, I used sticks for the exterior of the upper floor. I sculpted a hollow log chimney out of Sculpey, and finished up the structure with cardboard and more sticks. I wanted a thatched roof, so I teased some twine from a cat tree scratching post and glued that in place. To finish it off, I added a bark awning and shreked it right up with some moss flocking. Finally, it was time to paint that ent. I started with a base coat of dark purple, followed by a Bugman's Glow. I know this looks a little crazy, but trust me. I followed that up with a classic khaki dry brush, followed by a wash with Agrax Earthshade. The orange and purples just peek through the wash, creating a nice amount of variation in the bark color. With the tree looking nice and barky, I started on the mushrooms. My partner suggested a reishi color scheme, so I started with a base coat of off-white. Once that was dry, I went in with a Mephiston red, followed by an Overland Sunset. I blended the two together with a Dollarama orange and a cheap-ass yellow. Then I gave the whole thing a white edge and called it good. For the planks, I started with a tan base coat. I added browns, whites, and greens to make it look more weathered.
We must weather such things as we have always done.
And for the rock, I dry brushed blues, grays, purples, greens, and whites until I was happy with the look. Classic rock. With the painting mostly done, it was time to make some flocking. I made my first flock using dollar store moss. I gave it a quick chop and then ran it through a sieve. For the second flock, I used a floral foam block. I knew this stuff had to have a use. It is a terrible building material because it is so weak and so crumbly, but that makes it a great flocking material. I colored it using some watered down white glue and craft paint. And I made a few different shades of this to use throughout the build. I added some flock to the roof of the treehouse, and then I adhered some yellow fungus to the side of the building that I made out of a ripped up sponge. Once the house was looking sufficiently flocked up, I glued it in place. I could have used clump foliage for the tree, but I didn't want the house to be entirely covered up. So I opted for the much more time-consuming method of cutting fake dollar store plants into much more believable sizes. Was this necessary? Probably not, but it helps me sleep at night. Once all the leaves were cut out, I glued them in place. This was easy because I kept the attachment parts intact. With the leaves in place, it's starting to look alive. Speaking of life, where's that life-giving sap I mentioned earlier? I made some tiny tappers using paint tube lids, cardboard strips, and wire, and placed them around the end. I filled them with gold nail polish, then placed some more polish dripping out of the tree. Alright, enough futzing around, let's make a home for this guy. I started with these MDF dollar store boards. Next, I glued on a layer of stripped foam board and let that dry overnight. The next day, I carved a hole for a water feature and beveled the edges to look a bit more natural. I glued on a few more pieces of foam board to add a hint of elevation, then covered the whole thing in spackle. This worked okay. Next, I made a delicious looking goop out of modeling paste, paint, baking soda, and cat litter to add texture. I slurped that over the whole base, then sprinkled a little more cat litter on top. Then I let that chocolate frosty dry. Once it was dry, I added twigs and wire to look like roots, and rocks to look like rocks. Then, to add a little visual balance, I added a stump that I sculpted off camera to the opposite end. Then I gave the whole base a dark brown acrylic wash. Now it was time to make the ground cover. If you go into a forest, you probably won't see much grass. You'll see plants, detritus, and moss. I wanted this to feel like a real forest, so I used a spicy mixture of ingredients to create a realistic forest floor. I started with oregano, then basil, parsley, coffee grounds, and thyme. This smelled great. After this, I went in with flocking to look like moss. Once it was looking good and smelling good, I glued the end in place. I added moss to any areas where the goblins wouldn't normally walk. This created organic-looking pathways. Then I started on the pond. I sealed the area with black Mod Podge, and then added a few small rocks. I painted the pond using forest blues and greens, giving it a white highlight. Once it was looking good, I poured in a 2-part resin. To get rid of most of the bubbles, I hit it with a heat gun. Then I put a pool cover over it so that I could work on the rest of the build without disturbing the resin. Then it was time to add some plants to the forest. I added some cute little green stuff mushrooms to the arm of the Ent and to the chimney of the treehouse. Then I spent a lot of time off camera making tiny plants. I used dollar store plants and paintbrushes and all kinds of other supplies, but that's a whole other video in itself. I glued those plants in place anywhere that they fit. I made a quick little snail out of a snail shell I found outside and some green stuff, and then attached that to a branch. I gave the mushroom stairs a coat of glossy Mod Podge to make them shiny, then filled the forest floor with roots I made out of various wires, painting them a mossy green to contrast. And for one final detail, I painted a goblin warning flag for the treehouse. That's the last Shrek reference, I promise. With that, it's time for the reveal. This was super fun to make. I can't wait to see all the other submissions. Link for the contest will be down in the doobly-doo. Depending on when you see this, you might be able to vote for my build, so please do that if you can. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing. Let me know what you'd like to see me make next time. Bye!